people to follow him, it was an invitation to a relationship, not to a church, not to a structure, not to an organization, but to a relationship. And in order to be called into this relationship, in order to be invited by Jesus, you had to be a sinner, and you had to have lots of doubts, lots of questions. You had to, everything had to be kind of all out of whack. And if that was you, then you were a prime candidate. Those are the people that Jesus wanted as his followers. So most of us count. And we saw that Jesus calls us into a relationship no matter what's going on in our lives, but he doesn't leave us there, because the next step is he wants to draw us closer to himself, and we begin to change. And one of the things that begins to change, one of the things that God wants to do for us, is to make us not live on the basis of our anxieties, not to be anxious, but to be able to trust him for everything. Jesus said to his disciples many times, "Fear not, fear not, fear not." And then we saw that followers of Jesus all wear the same clothes, not in terms of what they wear, the actual clothing they wear, but the attitudes that they have. We looked at that passage from Colossians. Then we came back to the series a couple of weeks ago. We saw the fine print in Mark chapter 8, where Jesus said, if you want to follow me, at some point you're going to have to deny yourself. You're going to have to give up something that's very important to you. It's going to feel like a death to do that. And also following Jesus affects what we want, the stuff that we desire out of life, the stuff that's important to us. And then we saw last week that Jesus' followers make good leaders, great leaders, or potentially make great leaders if they lead like Jesus led. And this week our theme is unfollow. Unfollow. So at some point, we hear the call of Jesus to follow him. We get involved in this journey. But at some point, and for certain reasons which we'll explore, sometimes we are tempted to push the unfollow button. On Facebook and Instagram and various other social media platforms, you can choose to unfollow. So you followed somebody for a while and you've looked at their pictures. You get tired of the pictures of sunsets and horses and what they're having for breakfast, lunch, and supper, or whatever. You just get tired of looking at that, and so you decide, boring, I'm going to click the unfollow button. And this question all of us will have faced, or will face. If you're a Jesus follower, if you're a disciple, if you're a person who considers themselves a Christian, at some point you're going to face this question. Won't you bring up that question? The question runs like this. Am I going to continue following Jesus, or am I going to hit the unfollow button? Am I going to continue following Jesus, or am I going to hit the unfollow button? Now, we'll look a little bit at how this happens, how this plays out in John chapter 6, but for us, the issue is sometimes it just gets too hard. Being a follower of Jesus is just too difficult. So we still believe, we still have faith, but at some point we decide, this is too hard. What Jesus expects from me is too difficult. And the temptation to hit the unfollow button is not something that we do because we don't believe it's true, but we're tempted to do it because it's too difficult. Now, the incident we're going to look at tonight takes place in the book of John. The Gospel of John is John chapter 6, and there's quite a long thread that kind of leads up to this. But what's happened is Jesus has fed the multitude, 5,000 plus people have been fed. The people are really impressed by this. They think, Jesus could be their king. So they want to kind of sweep down to Jerusalem. They want to install him as king. They think there will be a popular uprising. The Jewish the leaders will support them. They'll be able to get rid of the Romans. Jesus will be installed as the king in Jerusalem, and it'll be glory days for Israel again. Jesus knows what's going on with him. He knows that his mission is on another trajectory, and so what he does is he withdraws from these crowds that are now pressing around him and wanting to make him king. He withdraws and he goes to Capernaum, but they follow him to Capernaum, and he goes into the synagogue in Capernaum. Presumably it's the Sabbath. He goes into the synagogue in Capernaum, and he starts to teach. He starts to preach. People are there, and Why they're there, we don't know. Maybe they're interested. Maybe they think, meant to get their friends and say, hey, we found this guy who just, fed 5,000 of us with a few loaves. Come see. Maybe he'll heal some people. Maybe he'll cast out some demons. Maybe he'll put on a show for us. And so they're there in the synagogue listening to Jesus. But Jesus gets very weird. He's got this captive crowd sitting in the packed synagogue, and he starts saying some very unusual things. He says to them, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." Now, for us, that's fine. We know about communion. We know that in a few little weeks' time or so, Jesus is going to share a meal with his disciples, and he's going to say, "This bread is my body, and this cup is my blood." So we know that this is coming. We know how the story pans out. But just track back a little bit and think what it must feel like if you don't know what's coming, all that stuff that's ahead. Here's this guy, this rabbi, in a synagogue in Capernaum, saying to you, if you want to be my follower, if you want to be part of this crowd, you're going to have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Okay, this is getting a little weird, but we'll stick around. We'll see what else he has to say. We're told that the Jews who were listening to him began to argue sharply among themselves. I'm pretty sure they did. We're quite well behaved mostly in church. But Jewish synagogues tended to be much more interactive. People would talk among themselves, and they would sometimes talk back to the rabbi as well, and they would kind of say things. So I think as Jesus is saying this, it's not that they're all sitting there, but they're actually engaging. They're giving him feedback. How can you give us this bread to eat? How can this man give us his flesh to eat? It's weird. Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood." What? You have no life in you. If you have no life in you, you're dead. So unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you're dead. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. I guess at this point, if you're one of the guys in the back row, you're starting to think, maybe it's time to check out. This party just got too weird for me. So I can imagine one or two slipping out the back way, saying, I remember I left a roast on at home, or, the oven's still on, or I may have left the lights on, or I've got to let the dog out, or, those excuses. For some, this is too much. And before we judge them too harshly, I think it would be a little crazy. Imagine if we had a guest preacher here. Somebody who's kind of done all the rounds, and we invite him to come and preach, and he stands up here in this pulpit, and the church is full, and he says, "Okay, guys, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you're dead, and we're going to have a meal afterwards." No, thank you. I ate at home. On hearing this, many of his disciples, now when it says disciples here, it's talking about the bigger group, not necessarily the 12, because there is a distinction between, he talks to the 12 in a little while, but so this broader group, these people who are all sitting here, on hearing this, many said, "This is a hard teaching." Well, I think that's something of an kind of, that's under, playing it down. This is not a hard teaching. This sounds crazy, man. Are you serious? And you'll notice, if you read the whole thing, we're not going to read the whole passage because it's quite long, but if you read the whole passage, Jesus doesn't explain. He doesn't explain. What is he doing here? Well, what Jesus is doing here is he's saying to them very clearly, if you want to be my disciple, if you want to be my follower, you're going to have to trust me. There are going to be points at which you don't understand what's going on. There are going to be points at which it doesn't make sense. You're going to be points at which you're going to be in places where everything seems a little strange, like the synagogue at Capernaum this day. Do you trust me enough to keep following me? Or are you just following me like a consumer? Because the people who are following him, they like the miracles, the feeding of the 5,000, that was great. The healings, those were fantastic. The driving out the demons, wherever Jesus is, there's a whole lot of stuff happening. And it's very exciting. But he's saying to them, that's not actually what it's about. It's not about the excitement. It's about, do you trust me enough to follow me, even when it doesn't make sense? Because he says next, aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, and as I said, the synagogues were quite interactive, so they weren't kind of sitting there politely as we would sit and listen to somebody and think in our heads, and this guy's nuts. We would be talking amongst ourselves. What's he talking about? Is he crazy? Eat his flesh, what does this mean? Jesus says to them, does this offend you? Does this put you off? Can you cope with this? Now again,